Look, I want you to imagine something very carefully, not as a headline, not as a tweet, not as something you scroll past while eating or commuting, but as a full system, like a machine that has been running for decades without interruption, quietly shaping almost everything around your life without most people ever actually seeing it. Because most people think history moves because of visible events. Wars, elections, presidents signing documents, missiles being launched, governments falling, revolutions on the news. That is the surface layer. That is what people see. But if you go deeper, if you really slow down and look at the structure underneath all of this, you start to realize something uncomfortable and honestly something a bit unsettling. The biggest historical changes almost never begin when people notice them. They begin long before that, long before the headlines, long before the crisis, long before the panic. By the time the world reacts, the direction has already been set, the system has already shifted, and people are just catching up to something that has been moving for years, sometimes decades under the surface. Now here is where this becomes important, because there is a growing argument among analysts, economists, and geopolitical thinkers that we may actually be living inside one of those rare transition periods right now. Not a normal downturn, not a temporary disruption, not a typical cycle, but something far more structural. A slow reordering of the global system itself. And I know when people hear that phrase, global system, it sounds abstract. It sounds academic. It sounds like something that belongs in a university lecture rather than real life. But the truth is, and this is where people underestimate it, the global system is not abstract at all. It is the invisible architecture behind almost everything you experience. It decides the price of fuel. It decides the cost of borrowing money for a house. It decides inflation. It decides job markets. It decides which countries can project power and which countries must adapt. It decides how trade flows across oceans. It decides how crises spread or get contained. So when we talk about a shift in the global system, we are not talking about something distant. We are talking about the underlying logic of the world you live in. And for roughly 80 years, that logic has been relatively stable. After the Second World War, a new financial and political architecture emerged. And at the center of that architecture was one country, the United States. Not just as a military power, not just as an economy, but as the anchor of the entire global financial structure. Its currency became the default for global trade. Its institutions became the referees of international economics. Its military presence became the guarantee of global shipping routes and strategic stability. And over time, this arrangement became so normal that most people stopped thinking about it. It just became reality. Something permanent, something that would always be there. And this is where history becomes deceptive, because systems that feel permanent are often just systems that have not yet encountered the conditions that will test them. We have seen this before. The British Empire once looked permanent. The gold standard once looked permanent. The Soviet Union once looked permanent. Even the Roman Empire once looked permanent to the people living inside it. And then slowly, quietly, sometimes suddenly, those systems began to unravel. Not because someone pressed a button, but because the underlying conditions that supported them changed. Now let's bring this into the present moment, because the argument being made by a growing number of analysts is that the post-World War II financial order is now entering that same kind of structural stress. Not collapse, not disappearance, but pressure, real accumulating pressure. And one of the most important ways to understand this is to start with the mechanism that holds the current system together, the dollar system. The global economy has been structured around one central idea. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. That means countries hold it in reserves. It means oil is priced in it. It means global trade is often settled in it. It means international debt is frequently issued in it. And because of that, the United States gains a very unusual privilege. It can borrow at scale. It can run persistent deficits. It can finance domestic consumption and global military presence at levels that would be extremely difficult for other countries. Because the world is constantly demanding its currency. In exchange, other countries get access to U.S. markets, financial systems, and a security umbrella built over decades. That is the trade. That is the balance. But this system only works under very specific conditions. First, the United States must remain the most attractive financial center in the world. Second, there must be no serious alternative to the dollar system. And third, countries that attempt to exit the system must face enough economic pressure that doing so becomes impractical. For decades that was true, but now each of those conditions is being tested, and this is where the structure starts to shift. Because the global economy today is not the same as it was in 1980 or 1990, or even 2005. Trade patterns have changed, technology has changed, political alliances have changed, and most importantly, financial infrastructure itself is changing. Let's start with trade. A huge portion of global manufacturing and supply chains is now deeply tied to East Asia, particularly China. That matters because it changes dependency patterns. In the past, many countries needed access to American markets above everything else. Today, many countries also depend heavily on Chinese supply chains, Chinese financing, and Chinese infrastructure investment. So the global system is no longer centered on a single hub in the same way it once was. It is becoming more distributed, more networked, more multipolar. Now combine that with financial innovation, because something very important is happening beneath the surface of traditional banking systems. Countries are increasingly experimenting with bilateral trade in local currencies. They are building currency swap agreements. They are developing regional payment systems. They are exploring digital currencies issued by central banks. And they are testing alternatives to older systems like SWIFT. Individually, each of these changes looks small, but collectively they start to create something significant. A parallel financial ecosystem, not a replacement, but an alternative layer that reduces dependency on a single currency. And this is where incentives matter. Because countries do not make these changes for ideology, they make them for practical reasons. Speed, cost, security, flexibility. If trading directly in local currencies becomes easier than converting through the dollar, behavior changes. If settlement systems become faster outside traditional networks, behavior changes. If geopolitical tensions make reliance on one system risky, behavior changes. And once behavior changes, the system itself starts to shift. Now let's bring in another layer that sits underneath all of this: debt. Because global power is not just about military strength, it is also about financial flexibility. A country that can borrow cheaply has enormous advantages. It can respond to crises. It can fund innovation. It can sustain long-term commitments. It can absorb shocks. The United States has benefited from extremely strong global demand for its debt for decades. That demand has kept borrowing costs relatively low, despite high levels of government spending. But here is the key question. What happens if that demand begins to fragment? What happens if global reserve managers slowly diversify into other currencies? What happens if confidence in one dominant financial asset begins to weaken, even gradually? This is not about collapse, this is about pricing. Because even small changes in interest rates have massive effects when debt levels are large. And the United States carries a debt load measured in tens of trillions. So even a 1% or 2% change in borrowing costs can translate into hundreds of billions in additional annual pressure. Now governments face a familiar dilemma that has appeared in many historical systems. You either reduce spending, which is politically difficult and economically painful, or you increase borrowing, which adds to long-term pressure. Or you expand the money supply, which risks inflation. There is no painless option, and this is where structural stress begins to accumulate. Now overlay that with something else: geopolitical fragmentation. Because the world is not just economically shifting, it is also strategically shifting. We are seeing increasing competition between major powers. We are seeing regional conflicts that affect global supply chains. We are seeing energy markets becoming more politically sensitive. We are seeing shipping routes and trade corridors becoming strategic assets. And this is where something very important emerges. The line between economics and geopolitics is dissolving. A semiconductor factory is no longer just an industrial site. It is a strategic asset. A shipping lane is no longer just a commercial route. It is a geopolitical choke point. An energy pipeline is no longer just infrastructure, it is leverage. Everything becomes strategic. Everything becomes contested. Now, in this environment, analysts often point to China as one of the central actors shaping the transition. But this is where nuance matters. Because the argument is not that China is replacing the United States in a simple one-to-one way. It is not a straight transfer of power. It is something more complex. China has been building infrastructure networks across Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. It has invested heavily in ports, rail systems, energy projects, industrial corridors, and digital infrastructure. These investments create long-term economic relationships, and those relationships gradually shift trade dependence. But at the same time, China also faces its own internal challenges: demographics, debt exposure, property market pressures, slowing growth compared to earlier decades. So what emerges is not a clean winner, but a system of competing constraints, multiple powers with strengths and vulnerabilities at the same time. And that is what makes this moment different, Because historically, global systems tend to be most stable when there is either one dominant power or a clearly accepted hierarchy. But when power becomes distributed among multiple centers, stability becomes more complex. Not necessarily worse, but more unpredictable, more conditional, more negotiated. And this is where another concept becomes important: the idea of a global commons. Things like maritime trade routes, financial clearing systems, digital communication infrastructure. These are systems that require coordination to function smoothly. But what happens when no single power is willing or able to fully maintain them? This is where a theoretical framework known as the Kindleberger perspective becomes relevant. The idea is simple. Global systems fail not necessarily because of war between great powers, but because no power is willing to bear the cost of maintaining order. In that vacuum, stability becomes fragmented, access becomes conditional, rules become localized, and enforcement becomes inconsistent. Not because the system disappears, but because it becomes uneven. Different regions, different rules, different authorities. Now think about what that means in practical terms. It means trade routes that are no longer universally governed. It means financial flows that are increasingly regionalized. It means strategic choke points that are managed by whoever has the ability to control them. It means a world where global systems still exist, but they do not function under a single unified logic. Instead, they operate through overlapping zones of influence. And that leads to something very important. Uncertainty becomes structural, not temporary, not cyclical, structural. Because businesses, governments, and individuals must now operate in a world where rules are not universally consistent. Now zoom out. If you look at all of this together, debt pressure, currency diversification, geopolitical fragmentation, technological change, shifting trade patterns, what you start to see is not a collapse, but a transition, a slow movement from one type of global order to another, from centralized to distributed, from unified to multipolar, from stable rules to negotiated conditions. And transitions like this are rarely smooth. They are uneven, they are contested, they produce winners and losers based not just on power, but on adaptability. Because in moments like this, the most important factor is not who is strongest today. It is who adjusts fastest to the new structure. And history is very consistent on this point. The Industrial Revolution did not reward the most powerful kingdoms at the start. Globalization did not reward the most dominant industries at the beginning. Digital transformation did not reward the largest traditional companies initially. It rewarded adaptation. It rewarded flexibility. It rewarded recognition of change before it became obvious. And that brings us back to the present. Because what is unfolding right now is not one single event. It is a convergence of multiple slow-moving transformations that are reinforcing each other. And the danger, if there is one, is not sudden collapse. It is delayed recognition. Because by the time systems change enough for everyone to notice, the adjustment has already happened. And at that point, the world does not ask what is happening. It asks how long it has been happening. And the honest answer is usually longer than most people assumed. So when we talk about the world moving toward a more multipolar structure, or financial systems becoming more fragmented, or global power becoming more distributed, we are not describing a prediction in the dramatic sense. We are describing a pattern that is already visible if you know where to look. The only uncertainty is timing, and timing is always the hardest part, because history does not announce transitions, it reveals them gradually, until suddenly, what looked permanent no longer does, and what looked stable begins to feel like it is moving. And by then, the transition is already well underway. Not as an ending, but as a shift into something new, something more complex, something more contested, and something that the world will have to learn how to navigate, whether it is ready or not.